Good afternoon, and first let me say we are deeply saddened by the tragic death of George Floyd here in Missouri. As you know, there were many protests that took place in Missouri and across the nation over the weekend. What happened to him was very wrong, and it has filled Americans everywhere with sadness, grief, and anger. We are also saddened by the acts of violence that have transpired across our state and our nation in response to this event. Citizens have every right to peacefully assemble and protest, and we support those who are calling for justice and peace. However, an element that seized on these peaceful demonstrations to commit violent acts and endanger the lives of citizens and bring destruction to our communities. This violence not only threatens public safety, it drowns out the voices of the peaceful demonstrators calling for justice and working to improve our nation. On Saturday, I signed an executive order activating the Missouri National Guard to assist local authorities at their request. At this time, we are taking a proactive approach to protect the people of this state. The National Guard and Highway Patrol stand ready to assist if needed. And I want to thank our law enforcement officers across Missouri for their efforts this weekend to maintain order and peace. We support peaceful protesters, and we are committed to protecting the lawful exercise of these rights. But violence and destruction will never be the answer. It does not help us achieve justice or peace. Instead, it terrorizes innocent people and families, destroys our communities, and creates more anger and pain. Every citizen deserves to be safe and protected. And to change things, we must not tear each other down, but stand together peacefully. It is hard to believe that it's been just over 75 days since our first COVID-19 case in Missouri, and that we are almost halfway through 2020. Up until this point, my administration has been very fortunate to have a strong, booming economy and a record low unemployment and high wage growth. We have at it many times had more jobs available than we have had people to fill them. Because of this, we have been able to focus on our workforce and infrastructure during those times. During these times, we have also been able to put forward responsible, conservative budgets to the General Assembly. Last year, we were able to leave $100 million on the bottom line in order to respond to any unanticipated revenue declines. And we are thankful we did after everything else that has happened. When we began this fiscal year, we anticipated economic growth, and we based our budget on that growth. However, it goes without saying that COVID-19 has had a severe impact on our anticipated economic growth. This is truly unlike anything we have ever experienced before. We are now expecting significant revenue declines, some of which may be larger than those experienced during the Great Recession. Just to put things into perspective, Missouri saw a decline of over 300,000 jobs between March and April alone, a decline of over 10%. Our unemployment rate, which has been a near historic lows for much of my administration, rose from 3.9 to 9.7% in April. We could have never imagined that this is where we would be today. But we've had to face the reality of the situation and make some extremely difficult decisions regarding our state budget. We have already withheld over $220 million due to budget concerns resulting from COVID-19. In addition to these restrictions, we will be restricting another $209 million by the end of June. These restrictions include the Office of Administration, the Department of Corrections, the Department of Health and Senior Services, the Department of Social Services, the Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development, and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Of this round of restrictions, over $41 million in general revenue will be withheld from the Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development. For DESE, over $131 million will be restricted, including $123 million from the foundation formula. Fully funded, the foundation formula is over $3.5 billion. In order to make it as fair as possible, I have waived the hold harmless statute. The waiver of this statute means hold harmless districts are not exempt from these withholdings. All local education agencies, including charter schools, will share a proportionate in this budget shortfall. I have always been a strong supporter of education. These were extremely difficult decisions I never thought I would have to make in just a few months. During my legislative career, I have consistently voted for fully funded education budgets. As governor, I have proposed budgets that fully funded education. And before COVID-19, one of our priorities for this year was to start looking at ways to increase teacher pay. As difficult as these decisions are, we are experiencing an unprecedented economic downturn, which means we are having to make unprecedented adjustments to our budget. We have had numerous conversations with DESE, the State Board of Education, superintendents, and administrators to keep them as informed as possible throughout the COVID-19 crisis. And it is important to make these decisions now so school districts can adjust before next year's school year. Our intent is to withhold now and avoid withholds once school begins. In the short term, we will be able to subsidize $187 million in federal funds distributed as Title I dollars to help a majority of our school districts. Today, Commissioner Van Dieven is here to talk more about these funds, and let her talk a little bit and explain that to you. Margie?
Thank you, Governor Parson, and good afternoon. While news about budget restrictions is never easy to hear, we appreciate the leadership of Governor Parson and his team who have worked thoughtfully through this process in efforts to help educators prepare for tight budgets and tough decisions, the likes of which many Missouri school leaders have yet to experience in their careers. With the timing of these budget shortfalls, the majority of today's reductions will be reflected in our June payment to schools, which is our final payment of this fiscal year. At the full funding level, our Department of Elementary and Secondary Education would have distributed about $315 million to Missouri schools in June. With these restrictions, our June payment to schools will be reduced to $193 million, a 39% decrease for the month. While schools are facing over $131 million in budget restrictions this month, there is some relief coming. Missouri schools are set to receive, as the governor just mentioned, $187 million through the CARES Act and the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. Nearly half of Missouri's districts and charter schools have applied for these funds, and as of today, nearly 100 districts and charters have received about 16 million of those funds. Our team continues to distribute these dollars as quickly as we can, knowing how important this supplemental funding is during these uncertain times. Now, while these dollars are distributed like Title I funds, they do not have the same kinds of restrictions. Instead, school leaders have great flexibility with these funds and can use those dollars for any COVID-related expenses dating back to March 13th. There's a wide range of allowable uses of these funds. They can be used to reimburse schools for costs incurred for things like technology and hotspots needed for remote teaching and learning, delivering meals and schoolwork to our students' homes, and even to pay staff members. We have guidance and a list of frequently asked questions on our CARES Act page of the DESE website. We are embarking upon historic budget shortfalls, and we remain hopeful that they are temporary as our economy begins to recover. To our Missouri families, we will continue to educate our children. The cost of not doing so is too great. The impact of these cuts may look different in each school across our state, and services may need to be adjusted, but we will educate and care for our children. To our Missouri school teachers and leaders, yes, our jobs continue to get harder. As I have said at each of these briefings, throughout this pandemic, you have inspired me and so many around you. Prior to this pandemic, we were discussing the need to elevate the teaching profession. Fast forward through these past couple of months, and I doubt that there are many people who do not recognize the importance of good teachers and leaders. Our communities continue to count on you in so many ways. And to our business and community partners, we look forward to working with you in rebuilding our economy. And we know how crucial a skilled and educated workforce is in that effort. It is imperative that we continue to improve lives through education. Our society depends upon it. So thank you, Governor Parson, and every education stakeholder in Missouri. We are all in this together, and we thank you.
Margie, thank you very much. One of the things, Zora's going to be up here just a second to talk from the higher education side of it. One of the things I thought was so important once we started realizing what we were going to have to do is to share that with the commission, with the educators around the state, with the higher ed community. You know, the one thing I learned a long time ago, you're much better off being up front, telling people the truth, make sure they know how to prepare for that when you're going to do things, instead of just walking in here someday and saying we're making cuts and then they find about it at a press briefing. You know, the reality of it is we got to prepare for those things. That's why we want to be very upfront with DESE and higher education to make sure they were aware that this was coming and that they would make sure that they could make those prepare. So with that, Zora, you want to talk on the higher education side of it?
Good afternoon. I'm Zora Mulligan. I lead the Missouri Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development. The expenditure restrictions announced today will certainly constitute a significant hardship for our public colleges and universities around the state. The amount restricted today essentially equates to the June payment that institutions would have received, and it's 100% of that June payment. This is a significant challenge. It comes in addition to some expenditure restrictions that were announced earlier in the year. And I want to be clear in that it will have a very challenging impact on our institutions. It represents a tremendous test for the leaders and our institutions around the state. It is likely to impact student services and the student experience as well as that of faculty and staff. As Commissioner Van Dieven indicated, the impacts of these cuts will look different on different campuses around the state, and so it's hard to make generalizations about how they will affect our students and our institutions. But one thing that will be uniform around the state is an unflagging commitment to the principle that education changes lives, and that it's our job as educators in the higher education space to make sure that continues to be available to the students that we serve. We've been very excited to partner with several other state departments throughout state government to begin to develop a set of strategies to support struggling Missourians and help citizens become economically resilient. Higher education is a very, very important part of that, and that's true whether you're thinking about a short-term certificate that you can earn with support of federal job training funds, or an associate degree that you can earn through Fast Track, or a bachelor's degree that you can complete through Fast Track. There are lots and lots of opportunities to grow during these times, even though it is certainly a time of unparalleled challenge. We as a department have been working hard to communicate with Missourians, their families, and school counselors about the importance of staying with it, of sticking with school. We hear a lot of discussion about gap year. My advice to any student or family out there is make a plan and stick with it. And even if your plan looks a little bit different than it did this time last year, continuing to invest in yourself through higher education is going to be one that pays off in the long term. We also have been working very closely with the governor's office and others throughout state government to help understand the ways that federal funds can help mitigate some of the difficulties that are represented in the state budget discussed today. And so when we look at ways that the Coronavirus Relief Fund might be able to support schools in their ability to open safely and effectively in the fall, or if we think about how the governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund can serve a similar purpose, I'm really grateful to the governor and his team for being open to those conversations, because while we all understand the difficult situation we're in with general revenue, we also understand how important it will be to be thoughtful in how we apply other funds that are available. So I'm happy to see everybody today. I think there's some closing remarks, and if you have questions for me, I'm happy to answer them at the end. Thank you.
Both the Commissioner and Director will be here afterwards to answer questions if you have any. Also, Dr. Williams is also here to answer any questions you might have on the COVID-19 or the testing. One of the things, just to kind of finish up before I go to the conclusion, one of the things is such a key why we've been so focused on trying to get the economy back, to get the businesses back open, as you can see what kind of effect it has. So the quicker we get people back to work, the quicker we get the economy going back, we can start adjusting. It's going to take us a while to get there, but I still believe the recovery will come quicker than maybe some recessions that we've been through before, but we got to get people back to work, and we got to open the businesses. So even with everything going on around us, COVID-19, the economy, civil unrest, we must keep pushing forward. The state has been through tough times before, and we will get through this by working together for a better future, for our families, and for future generations. Please remember, be safe, be smart, and be responsible. Thank you. God bless Missouri, and God bless the United States of America. Kelly?
Hi, Commissioner.
Hello.
Can you give any sense on a day-to-day level what, like, a larger school district or even a smaller one might expect from these cuts? Are we talking people laid off, services for students cut, things like that?
You know, I wish I could, but right now it's very clear that this is going to impact every district just a little bit differently. There are a few things to consider. Some districts count on state dollars more heavily than others. The CARES funds are distributed differently, so districts will see those in other ways. And you know, certain districts have fund balances that may vary from district to district. So again, this will rest with local decisions, making those really, really hard decisions, and by no means want to minimize what a challenge that will be for our state leaders, for our school leaders. So we thank them for doing it.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Van Dieven. I'm sorry, I apologize. I didn't quite hear everything in Philip's question, but can you talk about, did you say anything about how this is going to, when talking to education officials, have they indicated, are you keeping track of how this is going to impact jobs, whether that be teachers or any other staff? Are you guys keeping track of that, whether it be before today's cuts and moving forward?
We do not have that at this point in time. I think every district is going to have to look at the situation a little bit differently, and we'll be able to tell you that several months from now, but not yet.
Okay, all right, thanks. And then one more thing, summer school. Do you have any information as far as how that's looking enrollment-wise?
You know, it's very, very mixed right now. I think we've had a couple of districts who have started their summer school. Some have elected to postpone summer school. Some have talked about canceling summer school, and some of them have doing face-to-face. Some of them are doing it remote learning again, so very, very mixed out there. And enrollments are shifting as we speak.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy to answer any questions you might have.
I'll ask the same question about summer school enrollment. Do you know what it's looking like statewide?
I don't have a number statewide. I can tell you anecdotally the numbers are really continuing to bounce as students and their families make decisions about both summer and the fall. So I think it's going to be a while before we have good information. For most schools, enrollment for summer school doesn't close until a little bit later in June. So we'll know a little bit more, and I'll be happy to follow up.
Thank you.
Could you please explain how federal funding for higher education is going to mitigate some of these general revenue cuts, if at all?
Sure, that's a great question. So higher education generally does not receive funding directly from the federal government, but the CARES Act does contain some provisions that could be used to provide relief to higher education institutions. One option is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which the governor will use for both K-12 and higher ed. From our perspective, it's the least restricted kind of pot of money that might be used for some of the budget challenges that higher education institutions are facing. One note that I think is worth remembering is that although both higher education and K-12 institutions received funding directly through the CARES Act, half of the money that higher education institutions received had to pass through directly to students and couldn't be used at all for any institution purposes. What remained had to be used for restricted purposes that were very important in meeting the short-term crisis that was presented by the coronavirus, but it specifically could not be used for staff salaries. And so in that way, there's been a little bit of a challenge at institutions there. Another potential way the Coronavirus Relief Fund and the CARES Act might be able to help higher education institutions is meeting financial needs that have not been met by the funds that were received directly by institutions. So, you know, a lot of the money that went out this spring was for very short-term emergencies, hotspots, laptops, you know, things of that nature. This will be a longer-term opportunity to think about things like testing, you know, campus infrastructure, which in many cases isn't really sufficient to handle the volume of online education that's currently being offered. So there are lots of ways that federal funds might be able to support higher education institutions.
Is there any more federal funding coming from the CARES Act that hasn't already arrived?
That's a question that actually Dan Hogg would be more in a better position to answer. You know, the state has received a significant amount of money. Higher ed institutions have also received some. I think most of what we're likely to see in terms of federal funding in the future, unless there's a bailout package, which I don't know anything about, but would be in the form of, you know, specific purpose grants. And so we're certainly looking at grants as another way to make sure that we're meeting students' needs during this unprecedented and challenging time. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Dr. Williams. Have there been any other cases of COVID-19 connected to the Lake of the Ozark case of the individual who tested positive who was there?
Not that I'm aware of.
And is there any message you have as demonstrations take place and you see video of people gathering? Are there any concerns about spreading COVID-19 in those situations?
There is. Again, our mission every day is to protect health and keep people safe. And obviously COVID-19, one thing we've known all along is that you get community transmission when a large group of people get together. And so it makes us very concerned as you see large groups gathering that aren't either social distancing, and if they're not social distancing, wearing masks. So that remain, you know, there are lots of ways to keep people safe, and certainly during a issue like we have with COVID-19, that's another issue that's very important to us.
Hi, Dr. Williams. So Fort Leonard Wood completed some mass testing and found 50 soldiers or trainees contracted the virus. I'm curious if you're aware of any other bases here in Missouri that are going to be doing the same sort of thing, or have they?
I'm unaware of that, if they are doing that. Okay, thank you.
Governor Parson, there were protests all over the state this weekend. So what wider message do you think that the protesters have for you? And is there anything that you think you could do to further their cause?
Yeah, I think all along we've been trying to work on some of the issues the protesters are talking about. When we go to the St. Louis region, when I've been up there for like groups like Better Family Life, things that we're trying to do for the African American community up there through education, through job training, some significant resources we've been trying to put in those areas. But look, I think there's two different things we want to make sure and get clear here before we start going down the road. There is protesters, and then there's criminal activity that are out there. There's two different things. You know, when you see protesters out there talking about things and they're together lawfully, doing things they should, then I think what their cause is and what they represent, what they're trying to change, I get it. I understand. I totally do. But again, I will go back to when it gets dark and you get these people committing criminal acts. You know, I don't have much tolerance for that.
I guess what I'm asking is, what message do you think the protesters are trying to convey?
I think they're trying to convey what happened in Minnesota, using that for what happened, and equality to blacks, Americans, to try to say that they're being targeted by police. That's the message they're trying to say more than other people. And I think, one, you have to get the information in front of you to see what's causing that and what adjustments can be made. And I think that's what, at the end of the day, they would like to see done. And I think they're getting their point out by doing this. It's unfortunate that people are taking advantage of that situation, committing criminal acts for the people that are really trying to do it for the right reasons.
Hi, Governor. Can you tell us what guidance you've given law enforcement, like Capitol Police and the National Guard, on when to begin detaining people if things do take a violent turn tonight?
Yeah, first of all, I got all the confidence in my Director of Public Safety. That's their call to make. The Colonel of the Highway Patrol and General Compton and his troops, they're well aware of the situation. They've been through this before. Most of those are all seasoned veterans that's been through experiences like this. That's their judgment call. Again, we've reached out to the mayors over the weekend, the chiefs of police, been in contact with county executives all weekend over the state in different areas, making sure they knew we were there to help if they needed help, to be able to utilize our forces, what we have. And when I said earlier in my remarks, you know, one thing early on, I wanted to make sure the patrol was ready, that we were ready to respond, and it was important for me to get the National Guard ready. One is somebody that's got experience in the military, and one that's somebody that's been in law enforcement for a long time. You can never be prepared enough for situations of chaos.
Governor, Crystal kind of touched on my question, but I think it's important to hear from you, not only as the governor, but as you mentioned, former law enforcement. Do you feel there is a systemic problem associated with police and African Americans?
Yeah, you know what? Let me just say this. It's a pretty broad question what you're asking there, but let me say this about the law enforcement side of it, because I don't like pitting one against the other. I really don't. Because I think 99% of the law enforcement officers are out there, at least, are doing their jobs, doing what they're supposed to be doing. Is there bad actors out there? Yes. They always have been in those careers, just like any other profession. Sometimes you'll get people that take advantage of an oath that they should have never took advantage of. And that's just, but that's up to us to clean it up. And when I say us, I mean law enforcement and I mean public needs to clean up bad actors on that. You know, and we just need to be able to make sure we're both there, both parties, that would be the African American community or the law enforcement, figure out solutions to this. And you know, as we can see, it's a troubling time for our country, but you know, I do believe when the right people get at the right table, decisions can be made, changes can be made in this country. And if you look back at our history of this country, that's exactly what's happened. Exactly what happened. But this is something none of us has ever seen before. With the violence that's behind this, and what I want to say, organized violence for these criminal activities that are happening at night. This hasn't got anything to do with protest.
Governor, what would you say to protesters taking the streets tonight in Jefferson City? What's your message to them?
You know what? If they want to come to Jeff City and protest and they do it in a lawful manner, they're fine to come here. I mean, you know, we're going to run business as much as I can normal here, is what I'm going to do. I mean, whether it's the coronavirus, whether it's civil unrest, you know, we're going to go to work every day. We're going to go to work and we're going to try to prepare for the state of Missouri and make sure people are protected. So if they come here and they're lawful, they're going to have every right to protest.
Is there any concern that curfews, should they be imposed Tuesday, could impact elections?
You know, I'm not sure what all the city curfews are right now. I know some have them, some don't. I don't know what that'll be, and I don't know what adjustments they'll make for tomorrow's election. I don't know. There's a lot of jurisdictions out there. Right now, I know Kansas City, St. Louis, some parts of the city have curfews. I'm not sure what all they would be, but I hope it doesn't. I hope it doesn't. A lot of things are going on right now, but hopefully people can get out and they can go vote tomorrow.
Missouri has been recording data on police stops for the past 2 decades, and it continuously shows pretty significant disparities in police pulling over black drivers at a disproportionate rate compared to other drivers. One of the tools that the state government has is to reduce funding from those local municipalities where there are significant problems. So do you want to reduce funding to places where there's particular issues? And if not, what is your plan for, after 2 decades, finally reducing the disparities in police stops?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons, when the data you're talking about from the Attorney General's office, is that kind of what you're talking about, what they collect there?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
On that? Yeah, that data's there for a reason, but you have to look at the entire data, like where's the location at, where does this happen at, versus other agencies across the state. And to give you an example of that, if you just say you're in rural Missouri somewhere where there's not much of an African-American population, you could literally do 2 or 3 car stops, and that percentage is really changed, and it's not an accurate indication of what you might be if you're in St. Louis or Kansas City on a daily basis. So you kind of have to look at the population, and then you have to look at everything into that. And where is that happening? But it is a good tool and something we should all look at to figure out why is that happening. But a lot of moving parts to that, just to have a statistical number without knowing all the backgrounds of why that is. So it depends on where you're at. Depends whether you're in the city, whether you're in rural Missouri, how that all would come out. But there's a lot of information on that.
But do you plan to restrict funding from particular municipalities? And what is your plan to try and address overall disparities, which are shown in the statewide disparities?
Yeah, I think it's what you do as governor, what I've been doing. You go to the African-American communities, you try to figure out how it is you can really help, and how do you do a long-term fix to something like that. I'm going to go back to what I originally said when I became governor. If you really want to change society, if you really want to change things, it's not another government program that's going to change it. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to go out there and figure out, how do you take the youth of today and prepare them for when they become adults? And that's going to come through education, which you got to make sure everybody has that proper education, and they have the ability to get a job or training to be able to get out of some of the situations they're in today. But you've got to break the cycle, and that's how you really change those statistic numbers you're asking me about.
But I'm talking about disparities in police stops. Sorry, but I don't think you answered my question.
I'll follow up with what Summer said. Do you have any tangible programs that you're looking at right now to address what she was talking about?
Disparities in police pulling over black people more than white people.
I'm not sure what kind of program you're asking for. I mean, what you're wanting. I mean, each law enforcement agency has their own divisions, their own funding, their own cities and counties. I don't know what you're asking when I have a plan for that. I mean, if you're saying, what is the state going to do?
Yes.
It's on the local levels. Then,
well, again, what I had mentioned previously is the state has the tools in the law to restrict funding to particular agencies if there are major problems. And I'm assuming
why don't you refer to what you're talking about funding? Because I don't understand what you're saying. What funding am I going to withhold from a county or a city that has their own funding sources? No, you answer. You asked me the question. I'm asking you. What funding do I have the ability to hold for a city or a county?
The state government has the ability to withhold state funding to local governments if their police departments have massive disparities in arrests.
If you're giving them funding.
Correct.
Okay. We're not. What funding are you talking about? That's what I'm trying to ask you. What are you talking about? Are you talking about victims' money that we're giving for victims to the police departments? Are you talking about the prosecutor's assistance money that the state's given? Are you talking about drug courts that we're providing for the cities? I mean, what fundings are you talking about?
I believe included in the 2000 law that started requiring the vehicle stops data, it had a teeth mechanism. If those municipalities still had disparities, then the state could withhold funding as a penalty. So
Yeah,
I'm not sure
look-
if that's a particular agency, but I know that the state can withhold funding from local governments if there's problems there.
Yeah, I guess the only thing we'd tell you, we'd have to go out there and see which cities you're referring to and how that would take effect to the Attorney General's office and who's developing that formula, I guess, what we're saying. But I'm not for sure how you're addressing all the funding that the state goes, or which funding you're specifically talking about. I don't know what court fines you're talking about. I don't know what funding source you're exactly talking about.
Quick question, Governor. Were you on the call today with President Trump, the governor?
I was.
He today called governors weak in dealing with these protests - riots. What did you take that to mean, and what do you think about that?
First of all, he didn't say that.
Okay.
So let's make that correction
What did-
right off the bat.
Good. What did he say?
He wasn't talking about protesters. He was talking about the criminal element of people breaking into businesses is what he was referring to there. I know there's been a lot of hype on that since that all took place. That's who he was talking about, what he's talking about. He said that people needed to take the action, the resources they needed to stop the looting and breaking into private business, stealing, throwing rocks at police officers, shooting people. All this is what he was referring to as the criminal activity. He wasn't talking about protesters that were law-abiding protesters. That was never what he was saying about that.
So what did you think about the weak statement? How do you feel like you are in that spectrum? You feel pretty good?
Well, I most certainly do. I most certainly did. Everything that he was talking about today about activating the guard, we've already done. Having the highway patrol available to assist, we've already done. All those things. Look, I got enough experience in my career with the gray hair that I have. You don't try to start getting prepared for a riot after the riot's taken place. When you start seeing things like that happen, you need to prepare in advance, and that's what he was talking about.
We're going to take one more question. Governor, you mentioned that great things happen when people come together at a table. So I was wondering, are you actively planning any sit-down conversations with members of the African American community throughout the state to discuss police brutality?
There's no doubt that we'll be talking to the African American community, and I think we have all along in this administrative with a lot of the people. We were talking about the clergy and talking with them over the weekend, both in St. Louis and Kansas City and different people across the state, wherever it was. So, early on, I think, again, we had those outreaches there, not knowing it was ever going to be a civil disturbance, but we built up those relationships since I've been governor for this day when you could be able to communicate your message and say, okay, what is it we need to be doing better? And really, a lot of things we've learned that I have from governor, things that we can do better. And we were really headed down that road when it comes to bringing training, when it comes to health care to some of those communities. And, for me, I've heard a lot of politicians make a lot of political speeches saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But you know what? I went there, I went on their turf, I went up there and tried to make contact with people and says, okay, what is it you really need and what is it I can really deliver? And that's the way we've had a relationship ever since I started. After all of this, we'll be back at the table again. We'll be meeting with leaders across the state and maybe before, I don't know. But right now we got to find a common ground. We got to figure out how do we change the future of this state? And to the most part, how do we change the future of this country? Because the path we're going right now is not a win for anyone. It's not a winnable path for any of us. Thank you all very much. Thank you.